Good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to the second of our series of 4 free heritage lectures here at All Saints. The series began last week with David Robinson's talk on the Reformation as it was experienced here in Kingston. And this evening, it's my enormous pleasure to welcome Tom Holland, who is a person who will scarcely need any introduction at all. It's a tough call to introduce somebody who really doesn't need introducing, but I'm going to go through with it. Novelist, author, I'm sure many of you will know, of a very popular series on the aspects of the ancient world and also on the origins of Islam. Broadcaster, you may have caught him back in April playing a feisty and rather menacing William the Conqueror in BBC TV's drama doc 1066, a year of conquest. And last month on Channel 4's programme ISIS, the roots of violence, a programme that I think it's fair to say was courageous almost to the point of recklessness, but deeply thought-provoking. But the reason Tom is here by invitation this evening is that he is the author of a very recently published biography of King Athelstan, who was crowned in a ceremony in a church on this site in the 10th century. We like to say this is the place where England began. I'm sure Tom will explain the reason for that. The biography of King Athelstan is part of the Penguin Modern Monarchs series. I think that's it. Tom, you're very welcome. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. And it's a double thrill to be here tonight. Firstly, because this is my first ever opportunity to speak from a pulpit. So I am fulfilling a lifelong ambition. And secondly, because it is incredibly moving to come to a place that is sacred to anyone who admires, as I do, the reign, Athelstan, and not just Athelstan, but the remarkable dynasty of which he was such a significant part. I, too, grew up in a part of the country that has an intimate link with Athelstan and with the royal household to which he belongs. Wilton, a small town outside Salisbury in Wiltshire, is, if anything, even more boastful about its link to the House of Wessex than Kingston is. As a child, I would be driven in by my mother probably 3 or 4 times a week, and the sign that announced that you were arriving in Wilton proudly boasted, "Welcome to Wilton, former capital of England." Now, even as a young child, I'd been to London sufficiently to know that the likelihood that Wilton had ever been the capital of England was minuscule. But nevertheless, I was sufficiently intrigued by this to explore why this claim was being made. And of course, I discovered that it was because Wilton had indeed been the county town of Wiltshire, that's the Shire of Wilton, and Wiltshire in turn had lain at the heart of a kingdom, Wessex, that had played a key role in the making of England. And there were 3 kings in particular who had had a starring role in that making of England. There was Alfred, who in 871 had founded a convent in Wilton. There was his son, Edward, 2 of whose daughters had become nuns in Wilton. And there was Edward's son, Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, who had made the convent in Wilton 2 grants of land. And so, going to school, I would ask my teachers about these kings. And of course, my teachers had heard of Alfred. Everyone has heard of Alfred. He is the king least likely to win the Great British Bake Off. Everyone knows that. But I found that my teachers hadn't really heard of either Edward or Athelstan. And I think that that is true of most people. People have heard of Alfred, but people, by and large, are not familiar with Edward, are not familiar with Athelstan. And it puzzled me as a child, and it puzzles me now, why they are not better known. Very kind reference was made to my performance as William the Conqueror, which was pure acting, because having to play a Norman was awful. And it kind of distresses me that when children go to secondary school, they start their study of English history with a crushing defeat, the Battle of Hastings. And I wondered, why is the story of England's making, the story of the forging of what in effect is the most precocious nation-state in the whole of Europe, one that has successfully endured for 1,000 years, why is that not better known? And I think in essence there are two answers to this question. I think the first answer is that basically pretty much everyone kind of seems to take the existence of England for granted. It just seems part of the natural order of things. And I think this in turn is the fault of the Emperor Hadrian. Because of course Hadrian built his wall to mark off the province of Britannia from the barbarians who lay to the north. And it serves to this day as a kind of shorthand for the border between England and Scotland. So I think subliminally in the back of many people's mind is the idea that England just emerged from the Roman province of Britannia, just as Scotland kind of emerged from the lands that lay to the north of Hadrian's Wall. But if you look at the first picture I hope you got on your printout, the map of, this is a map of Britain in the 9th century, you'll see that actually there was nothing inevitable about the emergence of either England or Scotland. There are two kingdoms that straddle the Roman wall. There's the English-speaking kingdom of Northumbria, and then there's the Welsh-speaking kingdom of Strathclyde, which stretches from what's now Glasgow right the way down into the Lake District. And it's perfectly possible to imagine that these kingdoms might have carried on. That they don't is really down to one thing, and that is the intrusion in the 9th century of Viking invaders. And the Vikings destroy almost all of the English-speaking kingdoms, so not just Northumbria, but Mercia, what's now called the Midlands, East Anglia, and the only kingdom that they do not manage to overthrow and to cannibalize was the Kingdom of Wessex, ruled by Alfred, who, in my opinion, entirely deserves his title of the Great. His defense of Wessex was indeed a heroic feat that essentially saved an independent English civilization. So he merits his fame, but one of the reasons why he is better known than any other Anglo-Saxon king is because we have quite a lot, by the standards of early medieval history, we have quite a lot of writings from his reign. We have writings by Alfred himself, and we also have a biography written by a bishop who knew him well, and which contains what is probably my favourite line in the whole of medieval biography. God gifted him the disease of piles. Now, that's the kind of in-depth detail that we do not have for Alfred's son, Edward, or his grandson, Athelstan. And I think that that is one of the reasons why these two kings are much less well known. They are much more shadowy. However, they are not completely invisible, because even if we do not have biographies of them written directly by contemporaries, we do have other sources of information. We have charters, for instance, and crucially, we have coins. And one of the great discoveries I made over the past couple of years while I was in the process of researching and then writing my biography of Athelstan was the discovery that I could actually go out and buy coins from the period. I could actually get my fingers on them. And the brilliant thing was that I got a huge pile of cash that I'd been saving up to pay for my daughter's university education. And I thought, what the hell? It's an investment. They won't mind. And I think that when you look at the first coin I want to talk about tonight, you can imagine the giddy sense of joy felt by my daughters when I revealed that I had squandered their inheritance on this coin. And the reason that I chose this coin, I hope you can see at the top, it spells Pleegmund. Can you see that? And then underneath it says Arch-Ep. So Archiepiscopus, he is the Archbishop. Pleegmund was the Archbishop of Canterbury, appointed by Alfred, a former hermit, described by a contemporary as an estimable man, richly endowed with learning. And the significance of this coin really is twofold. Firstly, it's the last coin to be minted by an Archbishop of Canterbury. After Pleegmund, the royal control over mints is such that bishops are not permitted to mint their own coins. But secondly, the significance of Pleegmund is that although he is the Archbishop of Canterbury, although he is an appointment of the King of Wessex, he is in fact a Mercian, a man from the Midland Kingdom to the north of Wessex. And it's evident that Alfred liked Mercians. His wife, Aylesworth, was a Mercian. But the reason for Pleegmund's presence in Wessex reflected deeper geopolitical currents. For centuries, Mercia had been the great rival of Wessex. But in 874, the last independent king of Mercia had fled before the onslaught of the Vikings. The Vikings had put up and sponsored another Mercian as king, which the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written during Alfred's reign, dismissed him as a puppet king, as a foolish thane. The truth seems to be slightly more complicated. A coin was found a couple of years ago which show Alfred and Ceolwulf II, this very last king of Mercia, joined together in a kind of regnal brotherhood. But the truth of what happened is lost. We don't know what happened to Ceolwulf, but essentially, once he vanishes from the scene, the Vikings swallow the whole of Mercia up. Now, when Alfred defeats the great Viking attempt to swallow up Wessex, by terms of the peace treaty, Mercia is divided into rival zones of influence, a little bit like France in the Second World War. The Vikings take the eastern half, and Alfred claims the overlordship of the western half. But there is a kind of tension there, because Alfred is sensitive to the fact that as a king of Wessex, he cannot really afford to throw his weight around. He knows that the Mercians would rather have him as an overlord than a Viking, but he knows that he can't push his luck too hard. And so he sponsors a kind of studied ambivalence. He takes on a title that on one level signifies the fact that he is no longer just the King of Wessex. He takes on the title of Rex Anglo-Saxonum. The people of Wessex, the West Saxons, are obviously Saxon. The Mercians define themselves as Angles. So by calling himself the king of the Anglo-Saxons, Alfred is implicitly laying claim to the rule of both kingdoms. But at the same time, he has as his deputy in Mercia a man called Athelred, who takes the title of Michnachlafod, Lord of the Mercians. And if he is called Lord in the chanceries of Wessex, in Wales, and in Ireland, Athelred is called King. So there's a kind of deliberate ambivalence there. And Athelred proves to be a highly loyal and effective ally of Alfred. In 893 in particular, he plays a key role in a decisive defeat of the battle of the Vikings at Farnham. And to seal the alliance, Alfred gives to Athelred the hand of his eldest child, a girl called Athelflaed. And Athelflaed, I think, has every claim to the title of the most significant figure, female figure, in English political history that most people have not heard of. Like father, like daughter, she was devout, she was learned, and she was no less martial in her ambitions for her adopted kingdom than any man. And if you turn to this coin is my pride and joy. If, God forbid, there is a fire in my house, I will go and grab the cat, and then I will grab this coin. Because this coin, I think, is effectively the founding charter of England. You will see that the name is minted in around on the obverse from the coin, from the tower. It's got Edward. So Edward becomes King of Wessex in 899. Like his father, he calls himself the King of the Anglo-Saxons. But this coin was not minted by Edward. The moneyer's name next to the tower tells us that this was minted in Chester. And Chester was fortified not by Edward, but by Athelflaed. Athelred, her husband, had fallen sick. He died in 911. And Athelflaed, rather than ceding direct rule to her brother Edward, took over the title Micnachefdiga, Lady of the Mercians. And it was as Lady of the Mercians that she joined with her brother in what in effect is the first great pan-English infrastructure project. What they did was to build a series of towns, burghs, in a line from the Mersey down to the Thames. And Chester was one of the greatest of these strongholds, a former Roman city, a wilderness of rubble and nettles, the haunt of Viking war bands. Athelflaed had cleared them out, cleared the rubble, founded a great entrepot there. And this tower is emblematic of that. Whoops. It's a military tower, it's a kind of bulwark, it's the tower of a gate, but it is also the tower of a church. And the church, of course, is emblematic of the peace that Athelflaed has brought to Chester and the markets. And the markets serve to generate wealth. And that's why this coin is of pure silver. If you look beneath here, you see a little divot. Can you see it next to the tower? That's the pinprick of a Viking sword testing the quality of the silver. And I'm delighted to say that the quality of the silver is excellent. Now, the Viking response to this was less than enthusiastic. There was various attempts to try and seize Chester, but every time it was repulsed. And heroic stories were sung of Athelflaed's role in defending Chester across Wales, across Ireland. It was said that the defenders had boiled up beer and poured it out over the Vikings. My favourite thing, that they had dropped beehives onto the assailants, and the Vikings never captured Chester from Athelflaed. And one of the reasons among the Mercians that it was assumed that the burghs, the fortresses, the towns founded by or refounded by Athelflaed were so impregnable was that in 909 she had dispatched an expedition deep into the heart of Viking-held Mercia, what subsequent generations would call the Danelaw, to seize the relics of a warrior Northumbrian saint and king, Oswald. And they had brought them back, and Athelflaed buried them in Gloucester. And effectively, to have the presence in your kingdom of a saint as great and holy and puissant as Oswald was the 10th century equivalent of the kind of Star Wars dome. It ensured a supernatural protection for your realm. And sure enough, the following year, when an alliance of Viking kings led a great invasion of Mercia, they were ambushed and wiped out. And this victory broadcast to the entire Viking world that Athelflaed was a mistress of war as well as of peace. And that's what this coin is all about. It's proclaiming to the world that she and her brother are equally effective in the marketplace and on the battlefield. And it's this sense in which Edward and Athelflaed, between them, are waging an economic as well as a military war that is reflected in the next coin. Again, you can see here, very crudely stamped. I mean, it's much cruder than the previous one, Edward's name. And then you see underneath it the words Ebru. And Ebru is Eboracum, York. And it is that marks this out as a spectacularly incompetent forgery by a Viking moneyer. Because Edward, at the time, indeed ever, did not rule York. York lay under Viking rule. So the reason that this is minted is because the strength of the Anglo-Saxon currency is such that even a really rubbish forgery is better than coins minted by the Viking kings themselves. And it reflects the growing strength of this joint Anglo-Saxon kingdom. And it also reflects something else, because this coin was actually found in the Vatican. So it had been taken there by a Viking, presumably on pilgrimage, which reflects the fact that the influence of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom on the Danelaw was not just military, it was not just economic, it was cultural as well. The god of the Anglo-Saxons, his power, his glory, was starting to win the Vikings of the Danelaw for Christ. And so in every sense, the Danelaw by 917 were being put in the shadow of Edward and his remarkable sister. And that year saw a remarkable series of conquests that essentially ensured that the whole of South Humbria, south of the line of the Humber and the Mersey, would become part of the kingdom of Edward. Edward himself invaded and annexed East Anglia. Athelflaed captured Derby, captured Leicester, received the surrender of the townships of the Eastern Midlands. And the following year, 918, when Athelflaed died in Tamworth, Edward moved quickly. He had her buried in Gloucester, so near to the limits of Wessex. He had his daughter, he had Athelflaed's daughter, her only child, packed off to a nunnery, perhaps, who knows, even to Wilton. And Edward, from that point on, ruled directly as the King of Mercia. He was now, in every sense, a king of the Anglo-Saxons. But that does not mean that the fusion of Wessex and Mercia was something inevitable, was something irrevocable. Far from it. In 924, when Edward died, tellingly just south of Chester, so that implies that maybe he was fighting the Welsh, but he may well have been stamping out bushfires of rebellion in Mercia itself. This realm that he'd forged could easily have disintegrated. And that's particularly so because Edward, in his marital policy, was very much a precursor of Henry VIII. He dumped wives with an incredible regularity. His first wife, frankly, didn't measure up to what was required of a king's bride, and she was packed off, but not before she had given Edward a son who was given the name of Athelstan. Edward's second wife then gave him another son who rejoiced in the magnificent name of Ælfweard. And I think it's a great shame that Anglo-Saxon names have gone by the board, and I'd particularly like to see Ælfweard make a comeback. Ælfweard was brought up in Wessex, in Winchester. He was groomed clearly to be as the heir apparent to succeed to the kingdom of Wessex. Athelstan, meanwhile, was packed off to his aunt. And here we have this delightful statue raised in Tamworth, which shows Athelflaed bringing up the young Athelstan. And that meant that, in effect, when Edward died, Athelstan was in pole position to succeed at least to the kingdom of Mercia. And sure enough, within a week of Edward's death, he is issuing a charter in which he calls himself Rex Anglorum, King of the Angles, i.e. King of the Mercians. Meanwhile, Alfred is back in Winchester, and he leads an army up towards Oxford. And this is the first mention in any text of Oxford. And there he dies. And you might think that this is incredibly convenient. And many people have thought it's convenient. As an admirer of Athelstan, I will point out that nowhere is any hint of foul play suggested in any of the sources, and many of the sources, written as they were in Wessex, were quite hostile to Athelstan. Because what happens is that with the death of Alfred, Athelstan clearly is now the obvious person to rule Wessex as well as Mercia. But this is very, very unpopular in Winchester, the capital of Wessex. And it takes Athelstan time to ensure that his rule is accepted by the elite of Wessex. And when by 17th of July 925 he is ready to be crowned, he signally does not choose to be crowned in the city where his father and his grandfather had been crowned, Winchester. He chooses somewhere much nicer, much more scenic, much better in every way. Yes, he chooses Kingston. And the reason that he chooses Kingston is because Kingston straddles the border between Wessex and Mercia. When he stands on, probably not this stone, but let's pretend it was actually this stone, and is crowned, the archbishop who does so proclaims him as king of Wessex and Mercia pariter, equally. And Athelstan is now the king of an authentically Anglo-Saxon realm. And it might easily have stayed that way. We could imagine a counterfactual history in which Britain is divided into four rather than three. Wales, an English-speaking Southumbrian kingdom, an Anglo-Scandinavian Northumbria from the line of the Humber up to the Firth of Forth, and then in the Highlands, a Gaelic-speaking kingdom of Scotland, of Alba. That does not happen is due to the events of the year that I think, and I say this as someone who's played William the Conqueror in a documentary called 1066, is due to the events of a year that I think is the most decisive in British history. It is the year 927, because what happens in that year shapes the geopolitical contours of this island for a millennium and more into the future. We look at this coin. This was the first that I bought, and the thrill of buying it was all the more intense because, in a sense, the reason that no one really thinks of 927 alongside, say, 1066 or 1940 is because we have almost no sources that describe the events of that year. But this coin tells the story. This coin is minted in York. This is the moneyer of York. We know this because Ragnald minted coins for the Viking kings that had preceded Athelstan. But the Viking king dies in 927. His heir is over in Dublin. Remember, Athelflaed has fortified the city of Chester. She is therefore, and Athelstan are able to interrupt the ready flow of communications between York and Dublin. And that gives Athelstan his chance before the Viking heir to the Kingdom of York can arrive in the city to grab it for himself. And this building here almost certainly is the great Minster of York, not the Norman one that we see today, but the great Anglo-Saxon cathedral that had preceded it. And the fact that Athelstan chooses to put the Minster on it suggests an attempt to win over the archbishop to his side, to to ensure the loyalty of the English-speaking Christian elements within York, because his rule, of course, is quite unstable, but Athelstan's presence in York as a Christian king, as someone who claims to be king of the Angles, so the Mercians, the Northumbrians also are Angles, he is able, in the course of that year, moving northwards from York, to claim the submission of all the English-speaking lands of Northumbria, right the way up to the Firth of Forth. But that's not all that he lays claim to. On his coins, Athelstan starts to describe himself as Rex Anglorum, and of course he'd use that phrase just as the king of Mercia. But I think when he starts to use this phrase following the conquest of York, it has a slightly different signification. He's not claiming to be king of the Angles. He's claiming to be the king of what in Old English is called the Anglican, a people that we today would call the English. But Athelstan is not interested in ruling just as the Rex Anglorum, just as the king of the English. His ambitions are altogether more imperial. The same fateful year of 927, he summons the kings of Welsh-speaking Strathclyde, Gaelic-speaking Scotland, Alba in the north, the two greatest kings of the northern Britain, to a summit meeting at a place called Eamont. And Eamont is on the border in Cumbria between Athelstan's lands and the lands of the king of Strathclyde. And Athelstan chooses Eamont very deliberately because Eamont is stamped with the marks of the two previous empires that had been fashioned in Britain. There is a Roman fort there. So Athelstan is laying claim to the title of the heir of the Caesars. And there are great standing stones. And everyone knew that the standing stones had been raised by the giants who were the first to rule Britain as an empire. And so that's the significance of the fealty that Athelstan demands of the kings of Strathclyde and Alba. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports that all the kings of the island were brought under his rule. And so in the wake of this great meeting at Eamont, in addition to his title, Rex Anglorum, king of the English, Athelstan lays claim to another title. You can see on this, Rex To Brit. Rex Totius Britanniae, king of the whole of Britain. So from a stone in Kingston to a claim to the rule of the entire empire of Britain. And it is a title that Athelstan took just as seriously as his claim to be king of the English. And when in 934, so 7 years after the king of Alba of Scotland had sworn fealty, he rose in rebellion, Athelstan led an army all the way from Winchester up into the Highlands, harrying, looting, killing as he went, and forcing the king of the Scots to submit once again. The following year in Cirencester, Athelstan held a kind of a great durbar at which all the princes of Wales, the kings of Strathclyde and Alba, all the great lords of the various English realms attended him, and he sat there in state, king of the entire island. Now, again, this did not last. In 937, the king of the Scots rose in rebellion again, and this time he did it in alliance with the king of Strathclyde, and also, fatefully, with the Viking king of Dublin, who was still angling to get the kingdom of York, which he saw as his family heirloom, back under his control. And Athelstan, wearily, we are told, led an army north and met this great alliance of his enemies at a place called Brunanburh. And nobody is sure where Brunanburh is, but what we can be sure of is that the great victory that Athelstan won on that battle was crucial for upholding, if not the future of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, then at the very least the future of the United Kingdom of England. And like his aunt, Athelstan, if he understood the importance of success in war, also understood the crucial significance of the arts of peace to forging a united kingdom. And it was reported 200 years later by the historian William of Malmesbury, who grew up in the town where Athelstan would end up buried in North Wiltshire. He said, the opinion of the English that Athelstan governed them with a greater concern for law and for education than anyone else in their history is a just one. Athelstan was a great warrior, but he was also pious and literate. And if we look here, we see one of the most famous images of Athelstan. Here he is presenting a Bible to St. Cuthbert. St. Cuthbert, the great Northumbrian saint. Athelstan is presenting this on his way up to fight with the King of the Scots in 934. And Cuthbert is incredibly important to Athelstan because for several decades Cuthbert had been ruling the lands between the Tyne and the Tees despite being dead and making a tremendous job of it by all accounts. And Athelstan knew that the story was told that on the Isle of Athelney, where Alfred is supposed to have burnt the cakes, an older story reports how Alfred had had a vision of Cuthbert and laid claim to Cuthbert as the patron of the House of Wessex. So by showing his honour to Cuthbert, Athelstan was marketing himself as a king of the Northumbrians as much as of the West Saxons. And we have no reason to think that this was a cynical manoeuvre. Athelstan was deeply religious and endowed with a profound sense of the duty that God had entrusted him with to his people, to his subjects. And I suppose by 10th century standards, Athelstan would almost rank as a liberal. It worried him that, for instance, when he became king, that boys as young as 10 could legitimately be hanged for theft. So, the old softy that he was, Athelstan raised the age to 13. And then he raised it to 15. And the sense you have with this is of a man concerned to get it right, anxious that he not be too prescriptive. And it's one of those kind of shafts of light where you get a sense of Athelstan's actual character, as also is a charter that he issues. We don't know the date, but it's a grant of land. And it's given on the understanding that the person who receives this grant of land affords shelter to anyone homeless, anyone needy who requires it. And what is the date that this charter is issued? It's issued on Christmas Eve. So I don't think it's a stretch to imagine that Athelstan was reflecting on the Christmas story, reflecting on the lack of shelter for the Holy Family, and feeling himself prompted by this to ensure that the poorest, the most vulnerable of his subjects also be afforded shelter. My wish it is, he instructed his reeve, his kind of administrator of his lands, my wish it is that you should always provide the destitute with food. And as with Alfred, as with Athelflaed, so with Athelstan, it is this fusion of military genius with a genius for governance that explains why his forging, at least of a United Kingdom of England, proves so successful. And although when he dies, the Vikings briefly make a comeback, they're unable to hold on to their gains. And the loyalty towards the kingdom that increasingly is named England, solidifies over the course of the 10th century. And the knock-on effect of that is the creation of Scotland, because ultimately, centred as the Kingdom of England is in the south, in Wessex, the kings of England prove unable to hold onto England up from between Berwick and what's now Edinburgh. And over the course of the 10th century into the 11th, that is swallowed up by the King of Scotland, who also swallows up the King of Strathclyde. And so it's in that sense that Athelstan's annexation of York, his fashioning of a United Kingdom of England, is also what enables the United Kingdom of Scotland to come into being. And the lesson is, I think, that it takes time, effort, hard work, and a measure of genius to make a success of a United Kingdom. And his contemporaries understood that. 2.5 decades after the death of Athelstan, a bishop called Athelwold looked in wonder at what England had become, England that only generations before had been a kind of a wilderness of Viking-ravaged slaughter and devastation. And Athelwold paid tribute to the kings who had effected this remarkable transformation. Mature in age, he wrote, and very prudent, and far-seeing in wisdom, and hard to overcome in any strife. And I think that these are moving expressions of gratitude, because they're expressed by someone who appreciated what had been at stake. And Athelwold, who was close enough in time to Athelstan's reign when he wrote that to have been the great king's protege, he understood the scale of his debt. And I think that one of the great things about coming from Kingston, as coming from near Wilton, is that we too are perhaps the people best qualified to remember our debt to Athelstan as well. Thank you very much.
Tom, thank you very much indeed for that really interesting presentation. We have a few minutes for questions and discussion, if anybody would like to ask a question.
I have heard talk of a statue raised to Athelstan. Where do you think this should be? I know where I would like it to be, but where
Kingston.
do you think it should be?
That's a very good question. Obviously, I'm going to say Kingston because I am in Kingston. The only other rival, actually, and no, I'm not that smarmy. No, I'm going to say Malmesbury. And the reason for that is that it's where Athelstan was buried. And the reason that Athelstan was buried in Malmesbury is that it seems to have been the monastic establishment that was closest to his heart. And the reason for that was that it was where a saint was buried that was Athelstan's particular patron. And after Brunanburh, he buried the royal dead there as well. So I think that of all the places that that merit a statue of Athelstan, Malmesbury would probably be it. And I went there in the autumn, where I met your vicar, who gave me the very kind invitation to talk here. And we attended a service in Malmesbury Abbey to commemorate Alfred and Athelstan. And they sang Zadok the Priest as part of it. And it was probably my favourite moment from a church service ever. There were people dressed in Anglo-Saxon costume dotted throughout the church. And the singing of Zadok the Priest was sufficiently amateur to be incredibly moving. And I illicitly took a shot of, as the singing rose to the climax, I took a shot of Athelstan's tomb, and then it slowly rose up towards the ceiling of the abbey. So I think that even more than Wilton, even more than Kingston, Malmesbury is the place where Athelstan is most remembered. Apologies.
Fascinating lecture, thank you. The question I've got touches on some of the conclusions you've reached about Christianity and the free and liberal society that we enjoy. And I want to ask you, you mentioned in your talk the fortified towns that Edward and Ethelflaed developed. And of course, they were inspired in turn by Alfred, who initiated the idea of fortified towns. And there's a suggestion that his war-winning strategy was an imitation from 2 Chronicles, and the idea that the Israelites defended themselves by forming fortified towns and then garrisoning them. And I just wonder, it makes me think and reflect, how far from your own research would you say that Athelstan saw himself as applying the idea of the pattern of kingship based upon the biblical model? He was actually being quite practical in his application.
100%. And we know for a fact, we know that for a fact, and we know it for a fact with Alfred as well, and presumably it was the case with Edward and Athelflaed too. This was a profoundly devout family, and one of the reasons why I think they turned out to be such good kings was that they devoutly believed that they would be answerable for what they had done before the throne of God. And that obviously concentrated the mind. And yes, I mean, in that sense, you know, Elizabeth II rules as the heir of the kings of the House of Wessex. And there is a sense in which she clearly recognizes the degree to which kingship, you know, and queenship in England has always been Christian. And the temptation, perhaps, is to think of this as an enormous scam, the kind of thing that resulted in the French Revolution, an alliance between pulpit and throne. But I think you can see in the life of Alfred, and you know, perhaps in our current queen as well, that there is also a sense in which it can inspire in kings a sense of servantship, which draws on the paradox of Christ being both God and a slave who was nailed to a cross. And I think that paradox and that sense of lordship combined with a sense of being a servant was a crucial part of how certainly Alfred and Athelstan saw their roles. And I mean, and more than that, you know, you may wonder why this kingdom that emerges gets to be called England. Why is it not called Saxonia? The House of Wessex, you know, rules Saxons. And again, I think the reason for that is a Christian one, that Alfred sponsors the translation of Bede, who has an idea of the Angli as a holy people who, like the Israelites, have been given a promised land. And of course, there is the famous pun told by Gregory the Great, the Pope, in the slave market, where he sees Anglian slaves and asks what they are, and then wittily quips, not Angles, but angels. And Alfred, by sponsoring the translation of Bede and enshrining that and laying claim to the inheritance of Christian Northumbria, was essentially buying into that idea of the English almost as a kind of chosen people, although he never overtly said that. But also this notion that they, you know, that they are angels, that they are brought to Christianity by this great Pope, and that I think is the reason why ultimately it's Anglia that wins out over Saxonia. It's why we are England, not Saxonia. So I think that the roots both of England and of the English monarchy in the early Middle Ages is profoundly Christian, which is, you know, convenient since I'm in a church. So,
good evening. One of the great things, people love mysteries, and did you say it's Bruenbar? I don't know the name. The battlefield. Where?
Yeah.
Why do you think it's an unanswerable question possibly, but why do you think there is no record of where it is?
Why do we not know where it is?
Why do we not know where it is?
Well, there are as many answers to that question as there are theories as to where it might be, and there are two particular popular theories. One is that it's at a place called Bromborough in the Wirral, and the reason for that is that the name, the traces of the name, and the Wirral was settled by Vikings. It was the kind of crossover point between York and Dublin. I don't think it was there for the simple reason that it phases out the role played by the northern kings. They escape the battlefield, we're told, and make it back to Strathclyde, make it back to the Highlands. The likelihood that they would have been able to do that from the Wirral seems to me minuscule. Then there's the theory that is associated with Michael Wood in particular, drawing on a much later chronicler who reports how the Viking fleet came up the Humber, and so Mike Wood suggests that the location of Brunanburh was somewhere on the Great North Road, possibly on the border between Northumbria and Mercia. Again, I think that's unlikely because the probability that Vikings coming from Dublin would have sailed right the way around the north of Britain seems minuscule to me. And it's pretty clear, I think, that the story of the Vikings sailing up the Humber is an echo of Harold Hardrada going up there in 1066, before the Battle of Stamford Bridge. So where then is the likeliest place? I think it's, if you bear in mind that this is an alliance between Vikings sailing from Dublin, and we're told that they are within ready reach of the coast, and of kings coming from the north, the likeliest place would be in the region of Aemond. It would be somewhere in Cumbria. It would be, that's the obvious place for them to meet. And it would, so it would be somewhere in Cumbria next to a hill, which, of course, means, well, there's no lack of hills in Cumbria. And the reason I think why the location is forgotten is that it's just very obscure. It's not fought near a major centre of habitation. If it had been fought in the Wirral, chroniclers in Chester would absolutely have remembered where it was. Likewise, if it was fought near York, people would. But if it's fought in the wilds of Cumbria, it makes sense why it would be forgotten. And the implication of that in turn is that I think we will never know where it was. But I think somewhere in the Lake District.
You referred a couple of times to your starring role as William the Conqueror, and just a puzzle for me, to what extent did the Norman conquest sort of make the Anglo-Saxons in some sense irrelevant? Did they cut the thing completely culturally, or did it continue through? And that's sort of my question.
Well, in some ways to a devastating degree. English is replaced as the language of the ruling classes. The entire Anglo-Saxon aristocracy is wiped out, a kind of decapitation without precedent anywhere else in a Western Christian society. The orientation of England is wrenched away from the North Sea towards the Channel. So in that sense, what had been distinctive about Anglo-Saxon civilization is terminated. But in other ways, the very success of the Norman conquest is a tribute to what the Anglo-Saxon kings had achieved, because it's precisely that the Anglo-Saxon kingdom is so precociously centralized that enables William to conquer it simply by defeating its reigning king. If it had been reversed, if an English king had crossed and attacked the king of Francia, of France, and killed him, he might have been able to take over the Ile de Paris, but nothing else, because the proto-kingdom of France was just an agglomeration of various duchies and lordships, whereas England is a coherent whole that once you have killed its king, you can then take it over lock, stock, and barrel. And that's what enables William to commission the Domesday Book, for instance. It's the last culminating work of the Anglo-Saxon bureaucracy. It's sort of the great irony of it. And the truth is that although a lot of the Anglo-Saxon saints are kind of demoted by the new ruling Norman clergy, and although glorious names like Elfweird start to fade and the English begin to use French names, for the kings themselves, for the Norman kings, the Anglo-Saxon monarchy is a thing of great wonder. They honour it. They honour its antiquity. They honour the fact that to rule as a king of England is to be a consecrated king. You know, that's what William wanted, among many other things, was the unction that a king of France had. And so Alfred and Athelstan, and particularly Edward the Confessor, are honoured throughout the Middle Ages. You know, they're not forgotten. They're honoured, and because their greatness is the seedbed of the kingship that is held by the Norman and then the Plantagenet kings. So there's an ambivalence there, as there is, I think, to this day in our attitudes to the Anglo-Saxons. They are both, you know, the seedbed of Englishness, and yet they seem kind of alien and foreign.
Hello. The Scots are very proud of being Scottish. The Welsh are very proud of being Welsh. Why are the English so shy about being English?
Because I think that because the English were the dominant power within the United Kingdom that finally emerged in the early 18th century, it was easier for the English to identify themselves with Britain than it was for the Welsh or the Scots. I mean, the Welsh and Scots both did, but there was always a sense that if they identified too strongly with Britain, they would lose their Scottishness and their Welshness. I don't think that particularly worried the English. But recently, as a sense of Scottish nationhood has flared back into life, so actually, the kind of questions that you ask have begun to be asked far more by the English as well. And there is a kind of sense of questioning about what English identity should be. I think that, in a sense, Brexit was the English equivalent of the independence referendum that the Scots had in 2014. And the difference is that Nigel Farage won where Alex Salmond didn't.
We have time for one more question.
Hello. I was wondering what the situation would have been with Elfrida's daughter, Elfwin. The fact that she was created by the Witan to be ruler of Mercia for 6 months before she was deposed by her uncle. Was he concerned that his son by his first marriage would never be king?
We have no idea. We have no idea is the problem. She vanishes. We don't even know where she was sent. We don't know what happened to her. We don't know how long she lived. And so, essentially, we can only speculate whether it was done brutally, whether it was done with affection, how Edward did it exactly, we don't know. But what we do know is that clearly Edward had sufficient respect for his sister that he wasn't going to try and depose her. But his niece was very much a different matter. You know, there was to be no second lady of the Mercians. And I profoundly hope that whatever it is, the mayor of the West Midlands or whatever it is, that the election they had a couple of months ago, I would love to see him be given the title of Lord or Lady of the Mercians. It would be so much more romantic. So maybe the Lady of the Mercians will return to the Midlands.
Tom, you told us that after King Athelstan's death, things went rather pear-shaped. There were invasions from various quarters and massive losses of territory, which meant that his successors had to do it all over again.
Yes. Twice.
Do you think that fact in some way diminishes Athelstan's achievement?
No, because the Vikings turned out to be like a kind of a tide that couldn't swallow up the rock of the kingdom that Athelstan had forged. Had Athelstan not forged a functioning kingdom that could identify itself as united. Perfectly possible to imagine that, that Northumbria might have gone its own way again. The fact that it doesn't is tribute to the success of what Athelstan had fashioned. So I think it's perfectly legitimate to describe Athelstan as the first king of England for that reason.
Thank you. We think so as well. Thank you very much indeed. Once again, would you please join me in showing appreciation? Two notices, one very important. The bar will remain open until 9 o'clock, so do please linger and refresh yourselves. And the second is simply to advertise the final two lectures in our series. On Thursday, 6th of July, we turn our attention to the East Surry Regiment, which is another association that All Saints Church has. The chapel in the north-east corner is the memorial chapel of the East Surry Regiment. And we've commemorated the 1st Battalion's action on the first day of conflict in 1914. We've commemorated the regiment's action on the first day of the Somme. We now turn with Nicholas Howgill on the 6th of July to 1917 and the East Surrey Regiment. Do please join us if you're able. Thank you very much indeed for coming.